A circular economy is based on 3 principles: eliminating waste and pollution, circulating products and materials, and regenerating nature, all by design. When you think about that last point, regenerating nature, your brain might leap straight to farming and green spaces, but it applies to all aspects of our economy. Welcome to the Circular Economy Show. I'm Pippa. In this episode, we're circling back to a conversation my colleague Laura had with Josie Warden, former head of regenerative design at the RSA. They spoke at the launch of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's book, Circular Design for Fashion, in 2022. We'll hear them discuss what regenerative can mean within the fashion industry, the role of innovators, and how Josie's First Nation Canadian heritage inspires her to see the interconnectedness in our world. Laura started by asking Josie about the word regenerative.
One of the principles of the circular economy, the 3 principles: eliminate waste and pollution, circulate products and materials, and then the third one is regenerate nature. And I know that through your work at the RSA, you also explore this concept a lot in different ways. So could you explain a little bit more what you mean, what regenerative means to you?
I guess on a sort of single sentence level, I think it's about like that idea of leaving things better than the way you found them. And I think that is a fundamental shift in a lot of ways of thinking around, particularly around environment, which is really exemplified within the circular economy, that shift from like doing less harm to actually thinking, how do you really change things so that you're leaving things in a better state? But I think a kind of another layer of it is also that sense that the world is a living system and that things will be constantly changing and evolving over time. So we need to also think about how when moving to a circular economy, how we kind of create processes and systems that enable that continual change to keep happening over time. And so the idea of being regenerative is then thinking about how you kind of create the conditions for that stuff to keep changing and to kind of release the potential that exists in people and in communities to kind of keep meeting the new challenges that will come down the line. So I think that's how we're kind of seeing it, of that sense of it being a living process, and that actually the other part of it is that everything that we look at is nested. So when we're looking at like environment, society, economy, these things are not sort of separate pieces, but we're all interconnected, and that feels like a really important thing to explore within how we then move into a circular economy.
And what about the use of regenerative within the fashion industry?
Yeah, so I think it's been really interesting in the last year, I think during the pandemic, seeing the shift within the fashion industry becoming to talk more about regeneration. And I think it's kind of come from this sense that it's been building for a number of years, but there really, I think, has been this huge recognition, both from the industry and publicly, about the negative impacts of fashion. And the way the fashion industry has been going about change, I think, in the last few years has been, or in the last decade maybe, has been quite piecemeal, of like, let's create a single line of clothing that is like our sustainable brand, or let's think about our one material that we're putting into things. And I think both people and businesses are recognising actually all of these things are not enough to kind of tweak those additional things. So it feels like the regenerative kind of conversation in fashion has come about from that sense of, actually, we know it's not enough to do these kind of small things around the edge. We need to really think about a more kind of radical and ambitious change. And that's where it's come from. I think at the moment it's still, the kind of conversation in fashion is still quite focused on particular materials and how that connects to agriculture, for example, which is really important because that conversation, I think, has been not around for a while. There's been quite a gap and a divide between like agriculture and where materials come from, and then the industry itself. But I think it can be really exciting, and hopefully over the next year or so, seeing fashion think about actually how does that also go beyond materials into maybe how they work with the rest of their supply chain, how they kind of develop their business to enable them to kind of support people and the environment in the same way. So I feel like it's a really interesting transition for the industry at the moment around this kind of concept of regeneration.
Definitely. And I think, we're seeing a lot of changes and a lot of, let's say, new commitments by organizations thinking beyond their materials. So obviously, it's one of the main things when they think about their circular design, how they apply circular design as part of their business. But they are also going beyond that, thinking about the business models, how people can access whatever they put into the market, and also what happens at the end, like what kind of systems do we need in place to get those products and materials to be kept in use. What is the link between this kind of regenerative thinking or mindset and circular design?
I guess I see it as like a really key mindset shift within that designers need within circular economy and to design for circularity, because I think it sort of sets you on a trajectory of thinking like, actually, firstly, we're working in a world that is interconnected. So when I make a decision about the fabrics I use, that has an impact kind of down the supply chain to where it came from. It has an impact onto where this is going to go in the future. And that kind of getting used to doing that kind of zooming in and zooming out, which I think they talk a lot about in the design guidebook. I think that is a mindset shift that is really helpful to start seeing those kind of nested interconnections. So I think it kind of underpins that kind of way of thinking. And I think that second piece is then around like, how do you create the capabilities for people to keep making change over time? So I feel like it's still those two areas of seeing things as independent and seeing things as like, if I create a pair of jeans that needs to go into the market, how do I also think about the fact that the kind of system around how people buy things actually might look different in 20 years' time? So bearing in mind those kind of different layers of things, I think that's what regenerative thinking helps you to kind of look at those different mindsets in new ways.
And let's talk a little bit more about the work you do as head of regenerative design at the RSA. Why futures? Do you think that maybe that can divert some people from thinking about action in the present? Or why did you call it regenerative futures?
Yeah, so we call it futures rather than future, because I guess a kind of focus of this is like, we don't know what exactly this is going to look like. Similar with circular economy, like you know what the ambition is, but we don't know exactly how that's going to play out. So it's good to have the opportunity kind of to be able to explore it in different ways, and that it might look different in different places. So the futures bit is really important. And I think it's also trying to build that sense that this is not a sort of one-time solution, that actually this is a kind of, and I think that is another mindset shift, is seeing this as like something you need to keep working out. And I think they talk about this in the book as well, of like this circular economy is something that can be kind of solved. It's a kind of process of becoming always, and like how can you keep changing it, because there'll always be more depths you can go to or new things you can explore. So I think that's why we focus on that idea of like moving futures and it kind of keeping you going forward. But there are so many examples of this stuff happening in practice today, and again, as the book kind of brings to life, that I think you're right, part of it is then trying to explain to people and show people, inspire people, like what's happening now, of what this could all look like, potentially.
And I guess that for some people, like circular design, I mean, something that is very clear to me is that there are many ways of applying circular design to the work you do, depending on actually what your role is within the fashion industry. And it can maybe seem a little bit abstract sometimes for people. And I know that in your last report, you kind of created these guiding principles for designers to apply. Could you tell us a little bit more about what they are?
So we created a set of 8 principles to support designers to think in a regenerative way when they're working. And that's trying to kind of trying to get over the sort of automatic way of thinking that you might have. And so it's very much thinking like, if you want to move towards this circular economy way of thinking about, eliminating, circulating, regenerating, what are some of the practices you might need to support you? And so we've looked at quite a range of things, but I'll pick on a couple of them. So one is around designing for circulation of all kinds of things. So we're talking about how you circulate materials, but actually in order to get to a circular economy, you also need to think about how you circulate things like information, data, and then also other things, maybe like finance or power agency. Because we definitely found working with designers, like they don't always have all of the information that they need to be able to design a whole product. So actually, how do you think about circulation beyond the material piece? Another one we looked at was thinking about what is this kind of idea of nestedness. So how are you working on a project and being sure that you're looking at the next couple of layers up? So if I'm working on a pair of jeans, how's that influencing my organisation? How is that maybe then influencing the way jeans are designed across the industry? And one big area that we think is really important is the idea of starting from place and context. And that's, again, maybe flipping a conversation that when you have a big kind of global supply chain or a big global industry, it feels quite intuitive to start at like the big side. How do you make change in a kind of big way with those big players? But actually, what we're quite interested in, the idea of regeneration, is also how do you work from what is the kind of assets that are within a place. So that could be a town, it could be an organisation, and building things up from there. And that's quite a sort of shift in mindset for a lot of designers to be thinking about. So that's one of the principles too. But they're all designed to kind of get people to think slightly differently about how they're approaching the work that they're doing, and to create sort of spaces for new ideas to emerge.
Is this kind of place-based approach, is it something that you feel like the circular economy perhaps is not doing, it's not really taking into account at the moment, the narrative? I guess we do see a lot in cities, but for example, I don't know, like thinking about a village or a town, or I don't know, at different kind of scales and levels. What do you think we need to do to kind of like, let's say, put this in place, this principle?
I think it is a bit of a gap at the moment. As you say, there's kind of focus on things within cities, but I think it's I think the idea, if we're moving to a very different system, do we try and design that at a big scale and then like land it into different places? And I guess at the RSA, we work a lot on kind of social change things, and this challenge you see, if that happens within policy, you design something at a big layer and then you try and land it in a place, you get a kind of kickback reaction because it doesn't suit that place, it's not tailored, it doesn't work. And I think the benefit we have with circular economy, because it's trying to move to a very different system, is actually how could we, rather than look at that kind of homogenous idea, think about maybe there could be lots of different, multiple ways of doing things that collectively can add up to a different system. And I think that's the beauty of the idea of distribution within circular economy. So I think there's so much kind of fertile opportunities within places to look at new solutions that can work for that place. And I think it probably should be the case that, you know, a fashion brand working in California actually has quite a different approach to a fashion brand working in Mysore or in Mumbai, because they have different contexts. So I think that's really important. I think it helps people and communities to make sense of what's going on if you kind of work from what's in place. But it also just offers the opportunity to do things totally different. So as an example, there's organisations called Fibre Sheds who are working around the world looking at different ways that local regions can grow fibre and dye systems. So in this case, for example, California, looking at different kinds of things. In the UK, they're looking particularly at wool and materials that might be able to be grown here. And that is just a totally different way of looking at supply chains, where normally you're looking to kind of homogenise things. So I think there's a lot of potential in that, of like growing different kinds of systems from place. But at the moment, there isn't the resource and infrastructure to enable that across lots of different sectors. So I feel like that's an important gap to be looking at.
And what about the role of entrepreneurs? Because I know you've worked on this program called Rethink Fashion, in which you had a cohort of different entrepreneurs working on different, let's say, areas of the fashion industry. What's the role, and what did you, let's say, what are the main learnings that you took from this program?
Yeah. So we worked with 12 creatives from across different parts of the fashion system, and we did that intentionally because they are all, I guess, representing different kind of perspectives. So we had some from manufacturing, some from design, some from marketing. And the kind of purpose was to see how they, as both individuals but also a collective, could increase their impact by developing and enhancing their kind of circular design credentials. And I think the kind of key, I guess the role of innovators in that space is for them to be able to kind of signal a new future. They are not encumbered by the kind of challenges of the many existing businesses, and are can see that kind of direction and where things could go. So that's their role, and it's what's so exciting about what they do. What's so difficult about what they do is it's often so kind of future-looking that it's sometimes difficult to kind of get the resource or get the network that can enable them to make that happen. And they're also then working within a system which has been geared up to, kind of for one version of success. So what we wanted to do with the group was really see how they can support each other to be a kind of field of practice that collectively are making change together. Because I think it can often be a very lonely place to be that kind of innovator. So for them to be able to support one another, recognise they don't have the whole picture themselves, learn from each other, and then kind of work as a collective field to support wider change. And I guess that recognising that role of kind of convening and creating the imagination infrastructure. So how do they collectively think what that future is and where do they want to go together? And how can they then kind of work back from that into what are the seeds that they can put in practice together, both within their own organisation, but also collectively that can help that to move forward. And I think that kind of role is really important because it starts to build that kind of field of practice as opposed to just individual innovations. And I think that then enables them to have that more kind of collective impact.
So we're getting towards the end, but I wanted to ask you a couple of big questions, I would say. One is like, what is the kind of like bottleneck or challenge, that it's, preventing, let's say, a circular economy for fashion to kind of scale? Which one is the one that excites you the most to work on the topic and focus on finding solutions?
So I think the big bottleneck I see, which is quite philosophical, is I think a lot around like mindsets of how we understand the world. And I think the kind of seeing humans as separate from the environment underpins so much of our culture, but actually then really affects the way we think about the work that we do, how we relate to each other. And on my dad's side, I'm First Nation Canadian, and I just love the kind of the different perspective that brings, that part of my family brings on actually seeing the world as living and interconnected, and the trees and the plants being your relations and not being inanimate objects. And that's just like a totally different way of seeing things. But I think if you have those different like underpinnings, you can then build up to like different ways of doing stuff. So I feel like there's a big philosophical mindset thing that I think is challenging. And I think is actually shifting a lot. Even recently, I've noticed people talking about like, life being not just humans, but other things. Then I think in practice, when it comes to kind of the industry level side of things, I think the definitely like how we measure success is a really big challenge, because without those different measures, you will find people who are innovating within industries and within businesses who always hit a kind of immune response because what they're doing doesn't get captured or recognised within the kind of current way of thinking of things. So that's why I think things like the donut kind of economics framing of like actually how do you look at different measures and therefore what different business models are enabled to let you try things in a different way. So I think there's like a deep-seated thing, but then also some very like clear structural things as you kind of go up. And I think education is a big thing too, like supporting designers to learn differently. Because again, I think the industry is quite siloed in how designers learn. So if you're able to kind of bring people together at that layer too, that starts to kind of create changes.
Thank you, Josie, for being here with me today.
Thanks very much.
So there you go. I hope you enjoyed that conversation between Josie and Laura as much as I did. As Josie said, it's important to think beyond the materials and learn how to apply circular design to the whole supply chain. Later in this series, we'll revisit Laura's conversation with Rudo Nondo from Fashion Revolution, who discuss why storytelling is at the heart of circular design for fashion and the lessons she's taken from Zimbabwe's clothing industry. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Circular Economy Show from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. If you liked it, then please leave a review or share it on your socials to help us spread the word. See you next time.